It isn't often that a place becomes synonymous with a product, but that is exactly what happened to Fletton. A small rural village in Huntingdonshire gave its name to perhaps one of the most famous building materials, the Fletton brick. The Fletton brick was produced by the London Brick Company. This short presentation will explore how one man, the founder of the London Brick Company, John Cathles Hill, shaped our village of Fletton. John was born in 1858 in Dundee, Scotland. He was the eldest son of Robert and Elizabeth. Robert was a Presbyterian Kirk elder and local entrepreneur, and John was brought up with a strict moral code and strong work ethic. At 17, John left home to become a journeyman carpenter, but he was aspirational. Within a year, he was studying architecture and construction at the Mechanics Institute in Glasgow. Once his studies were complete, John had his eye on the capital. At just 21, he left Glasgow, destination London. Within 2 years, John had developed his business and employed 8 men. He became a property speculator, building housing estates in Islington, Haringey and Crouch End for London's workers. The year was now 1888, and John needed to secure a steady, reliable source of bricks at a good price for his housing developments. He travelled north to Fletton. Rumour has it that he bought all the bricks available. On his return journey, John realised that it would make good business sense if he owned a brickyard. Then he could control the supply and cost of the bricks that he needed. It was with the purchase of this first brickyard, Hardy's Yard in Fletton, that John founded the London Brick Company. Fletton had been developing at a steady pace since 1841, when the small rural village had a population of just 256. In 1847, the railways arrived in the north of the parish. The area around the railway station, New Fletton, began to expand as railway workers and associated industries arrived. A second population increase occurred after 1877, when Nathaniel and George Hempstead discovered the clay that burned and opened their brickyards in the south of the parish, Old Fletton. By 1881, the population had grown to a little over 1,840. But brickmaking is a costly venture, and the Hempstead brothers had been made bankrupt. Some of their brickyards had closed, and some were running at a loss. By a process of purchases and mergers, John gradually bought other brickyards in Fletton. He used the unique properties of the clay that burned and manufacturing bricks all the year round to change the face of brickmaking. In so doing, he attracted workers with their families to Fletton. As the London Brick Company expanded, Fletton saw an influx of brick workers, and by 1911 the population of Fletton reached 4,742. The brickyards attracted men with a variety of skills. Skilled workers such as stationary engine drivers and moulders tended to migrate from further afield places, whilst local agricultural workers exchanged seasonal work on the land for that of secure labouring employment in the brickyards. What these families needed was housing. John cared about his workers and built houses for them, not only in Fletton but in the nearby parish of Woodston as well. In doing this, he created a community. In fact, he became known as the maker of modern Fletton. Roads such as Milton Road, Duke Street, Prince's Road, St Margaret's Road and Belsize Avenue are all streets built by the London Brick Company for their workers. John built modern 2-up, 2-down houses. They had a small front garden, a long rear garden which encouraged vegetable growing, and often a pigsty at the bottom. At the top of the image on the right, you can see the straight streets of the new development that John built. The impact of John's house building can be seen on this slide. In 1881, there were 390 dwellings in Fletton, and by 1911 this had increased to 983. Whilst in Woodston, in 1881, there were just 181 dwellings, which by 1911 had increased to 636. Obviously, not all house building was solely due to John and the London Brick Company. but he was a considerable factor in Fletton's expansion. Not only did John build homes for his workers, but he also provided for the wider community as well. He established shops. He built Fourpress House, a coffee palace, which became the location of many meetings and community functions. He contributed to the building of Fletton School, known affectionately as the School on the Hill. He provided funds for an extension at St Margaret's Church, and he supported the building of the United Methodist Chapel on Fletton Avenue. In terms of its growth, Fletton was quite unique. Not only were unmarried men attracted to work in the brickyards, but married men, together with their families, were also drawn by the opportunities available. This arrival of families brought an abundance of female labour, and it had a knock-on effect. Taking the offer of building on London Brick Company land, companies like Farrows Canning and Symington corset makers arrived in Fletton to take advantage of the ready supply of labour. John Hill and the London Brick Company were an all-pervading influence in Fletton. At a high in 1901, 28.4% of all household heads in Fletton were employed in the brickyards. But of course, the real number of men and women who were employed in the brickmaking industry was far higher. John influenced every aspect of life in Fletton for his workers through his active role in both local and regional politics. Although he never lived in the area himself, his mother and father lived on London Road and were his eyes and ears in the Fletton community. But brickmaking is a precarious business, reliant as it is on the boom and bust of the house-building industry. John built his empire on loans, and when these were called in 1912, he was declared bankrupt and sadly died a few years later. But despite his bankruptcy, the London Brick Company survived and flourished, and John's legacy lived on. In 1926, director Malcolm Stewart merged the London Brick Company with another notable brick producer, Forders Limited, and in 1936 the name of the company was known simply as the London Brick Company, or LBC. After the Second World War, bricks were in great demand to rebuild Britain, but due to hostilities, LBC had closed 20 of its brickworks, leaving only 5 or 6 in production. To restart production, migrant workers were once again required. This time, the men who answered the call came from Italy. Each year, LBC representatives went to recruit men from Sicily, Sardinia, and southern Italy. About 3,000 Italian men and their families travelled to Fletton and established new lives in the brickmaking community, which welcomed them with open arms. Times may have changed, but provision from the LBC workers continued, with a swimming pool, sports teams, various clubs, social occasions, and even a fire and ambulance service. John founded a company, LBC, that at its height was the largest brick producer in the world. But more than that, he forged an industrial village and a community which still thrives today. Thank you for listening to this presentation.